You're welcome to be seated. Shabbat Shalom. Yet again. This first part of a story that's often entitled The Oven of Achnai, Tanor Shel Achnai, is one that many of you in this room have heard before. So we'll start out with this first part. We'll ask the question again, what does this mean, lo bashamayim hi, that the Torah is not in heaven? We'll discuss that for a little, and then we'll read part B, which is not taught as often as part A. So part A. An oven was constructed out of the layers of clay with sand in between the layers. Rabbi Eliezer says, this is a pure oven. And the rest of the sages say, this is impure. Rabbi Eliezer brought every argument under the sun, but they would not accept it. So this is part of the Talmud Bavli, Masechet Bava Metzia, which is about finding lost things or returning lost items. Rabbi Eliezer said, the law goes according to me, and this carob tree will prove it. So he points to a carob tree. The carob tree uproots and moves 100 yards. The sages responded, we don't accept proof from trees. Rabbi Eliezer tried again. The law goes according to me, and this river will prove it. And the river turned around and flowed backwards. The sages responded, we don't accept proof from water. Rabbi Eliezer tried a third time. The law goes according to me, and this Beit Midrash, this house of study, will prove it. And the walls of the Beit Midrash began to collapse in on themselves. And keep in mind, they're having this conversation inside of the Beit Midrash. Rabbi Joshua got to his feet and shouted at the walls, if the sages are disputing a point of law, what business is it of yours? And the walls stopped collapsing in out of respect for Rabbi Joshua, but they didn't straighten out of respect for Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer tried one last time. The law goes according to me, and heaven will prove it. So the divine voice, the Bat Kol, came out of heaven and announced, what are you arguing about? The law goes according to Rabbi Eliezer on all matters. Rabbi Joshua got to his feet and shouted, Lo bashabayim hi, it is not in heaven. Rabbi Yirmiyah explains, Torah was already given at Mount Sinai. From that point on, we don't rule according to divine voices. We don't rule according to a voice that comes from God, God's self. As it says in the Torah, written by God, of course, after the majority, you should incline. Sometime later, Rabbi Nathan met Elijah the prophet and asked, what was God doing at that time? And Elijah replied, the Holy One was laughing and saying, my children have defeated me. My children have defeated me. So our first question, if the Torah is no longer in heaven, lo bashamayim hi, what does that say about the methodology and the purpose of our Jewish text study, of our law and our practice? Sid? So we as a people need to have those discussions. And I think that's where the majority to incline comes from, right? That if we as a people are responsible for making this decision, there has to be a group of people who agrees before we can make a decision into law. Cliff?
God's work is done, it's on us.
God's work is done, it's on us now. Think about that. And this is a little bit of what the rabbis are saying, but think about that. God's work is done. So what in the world is the point of all this prayer that we're doing if God's work is done? Roz?
Does that mean there's no more divine inspiration?
Yeah. Does that mean that there's no more divine inspiration? Or does maybe God is no longer involved in law, but then now that God's no longer involved in law, there are other things God can do? Mary? So there's both the personal connection and that communal connection, right? It can't just be one or the other. And John and John and John and then John.
I heard a Devar Torah from Lord Rabbi Sachs,
Mm-hmm.
blessed memory, about the argument for the sake of heaven between Hillel and Shammai in the Mishnah. And it just made me think that it was a great teaching about there's not it's almost like the point of the argument is to draw us closer to We're supposed to draw closer to Hashem through the wrestling with the text. And that through the study and the wrestling with the meaning of it, it actually is intended to draw us closer to the divine.
So the wrestling draws us closer to the divine, but in this story, we've got one character who's close to the divine. He's got such a close relationship with God that God will cause rivers to run backwards for him, will uproot trees for him, but he doesn't win. The other group does, even though they don't have that power. John?
So the question is, what does this say about methodology and purpose of Jewish text study and law? And what I think it's saying is that the methodology and purpose should be based on the text of the Torah itself. Because the Torah is no longer in heaven. We have the text, it's up to us to interpret it now. Who's to interpret it? The majority of the Torah itself is the
Right.
majority.
So we're not listening to God from up on high. We're listening to this text in our hands. And you can see that in the text itself, in this story itself, because the rabbis are actually quoting from Torah as they're making their arguments. And if you see Rabbi Joshua's argument, Lo bashamayim hi, that's from our parsha today. Rabbi Yirmiyah's argument, after the majority you should incline, that's Exodus. God, you already wrote this stuff. This is what you gave us. We love you, God, but this is our law, right? It's done. And Gary?
So I think that that's right. I think that the Torah was given to us, and that's the law. My question is twofold, I guess, or my response to that is twofold. When we read the Torah over and over again, year after year after year, it's the same text, and yet every time we read it, we take something different from it because we've changed in the course of that year, because the world has changed in the course of that year. And the brilliance of the Torah itself is that it's relevant to us regardless of what year it is, what day it is, what time we're reading it. It's relevant to us for all of those things. But my argument with this is it isn't always the majority. Even if you look at the Supreme Court always issues a majority and minority opinion. Even though the majority will win, there's still a minority opinion that has to be taken into consideration. The committee that the conservative group has also does the same thing. Everyone writes about it, everyone puts in their opinion, and the committee comes to a decision as a group, but there's still the minority opinion. And I think that it would be a mistake to say that it's always the majority opinion that we follow, because if that was the case, Reform Judaism would be the Judaism that we all practice. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily a good thing, but the majority of Jews right now are Reform Jews, at least in this country. So I think that, yes, we have to go along with the majority in most cases, but we also can't forget about the minority.
So Gary's complication with this is with the emphasis of after the majority you should incline. Even though that is from Torah, these rabbis are using it kind of to speak kind of in conflict with God. And I love bringing, and also in Talmud elsewhere, there's actually a whole section about making sure we preserve the minority. If we didn't, the Talmud would be much shorter, and this story wouldn't even be in there, right? We would just have the law about what a kosher oven looked like, and not consider Rabbi Eliezer at all. And I think that your comment is a really great segue into part B. Before we get to part B, though, I want us to keep Gary's comment in mind, but just to present how this is often used, how this story and interpretation of Lo Bashamayim he is often used. So in our three major movements, in Orthodoxy, this story is used as not a we all have access to law, and so we all, the majority today has access to inventing law. For Orthodoxy, by and large, this is the proof text for why the rabbis of the Talmud, why the law of the rabbis of the Talmud is just as important as law as written in the Torah. This is what gives the rabbis of the Talmud their authority. So that's Orthodoxy. In the Reform movement, like you said, Gary, this is the opposite, right? This is Lo Bashamayim hi. It's not in heaven. We can each interpret it. We should each interpret it on our own. Right? We already have the text. It's our job. And conservative movement, as always, is somewhere in the middle, right? Is we both have the authority of tradition, and we also have the authority of Jewish community today, of that majority today. And we have to wrestle with both. And the conservative movement and Orthodoxy both, I don't know how the Reform movement deals with this next part, but I think part of their reading depends also on this next part. And we're not going to read all of it, it's quite long. But after that day, I'll read bits and pieces, but in part 2, on that day, the sages brought all of the items deemed ritually pure by Rabbi Eliezer and burned them in fire. And they reached a consensus in his regard, and they ostracized him. They kicked him out of the Beit Midrash. So Rabbi Eliezer is so upset about this that when his eyes shed tears, the whole world was afflicted. 1/3 of the olives, 1/3 of the wheat, and 1/3 of the barley all died. Some even said that the dough kneaded in a woman's hand spoiled. Any place that Rabbi Eliezer fixed his gaze was burned. When Rabban Gamliel, who was the leader of the sages at the time, went on a boat, the sea threatened to turn his boat over. And then when Rabbi Eliezer prayed to God, or tried to pray to God, his wife, Ima Shalom, knew that prayer would have the effect of killing Rabban Gamliel, so she tried with all of her might to stop him from his prayer, and was distracted for a moment. Rabbi Eliezer got his prayer in, and Rabban Gamliel immediately died. This was the power that Rabban Gamliel had. And so I think it's a mistake when we learn about part 1 of the story and stop there. Part 2 is really important because Rabbi Eliezer, who in this story is representing God's power, is still quite significant, still has that power in the world. Right? That we can't look at Jewish law in a vacuum. We can't look at Jewish law as over and done with. And we can't assume that we, as human beings, know exactly what we're supposed to do, know exactly what God expects from us. We have to also consider what are the parts that we're missing, what are the parts that God still has to teach us, and listen in for those parts that God still has to teach us. There's a risk. There's a risk in assuming that we know exactly what to do. So we still have to keep our ears and our eyes open. I'm curious at Kiddush lunch to learn a little bit more about your perspective on part 1 and part 2, but for now we're going to continue with Musa, with Sid, and you can learn more with John in the library. Shabbat Shalom.